بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته everyone. I hope you're well. This is the second lesson of Aqidah Tahawiyyah. It's a short introduction to Aqidah, and I hope in the coming months and years we can go on to more advanced texts with Imam Tahawi and other important scholars of theology and kalam. So the commentator says, وَلِنَرْجِعْ إِلَى الشَّرْعِ. Let's move to the shara. Let's get involved in the text as well. So this bold text here is what's called the matan. That's what Imam Tahawi has written. Okay, so I'll read that for you and I'll translate it. And then this, which is not in bold, is what is the commentary by Imam Ghaznavi. So he says, Imam Tahawi says, قال التحاوي رحمه الله. Imam Tahawi says, may Allah have mercy upon him. هذا ذكر بيان عقيدة أهل السنة والجماعة على مذهب فقهاء الملة. This is an exposition. This is a discussion of the creed of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah according to على مذهب فقهاء الملة فقهاء الملة أبي حنيفة النعمان بن ثابت الكوفي. So that's the name of Imam Abu Hanifah Kufi, which is where he was based, so that's ascribed to him. And then his student Abu Yusuf Yaqub bin Ibrahim al-Ansari, who was also a very famous student of his. And then he says, Abi Abdullah Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. And Abi Abdullah Muhammad Hasan al-Shaybani is very famous as well. And then he says, وَمَا يَعْتَقِدُونَ فِي أُصُولِ الدِّينِ, in terms of what they consider, what is consisting of the foundations of the religion that they believed in, and وَيَدِينُونَ بِهِ لِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ, and in terms of what they submitted to as to the Lord of the world, لِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Of course, you know that from the chapter of Fatiha. You know that from the chapter of Fatiha. Okay, so that's just the matan, and this is what we're going to discuss in today's session. So he's began by mentioning Imam Abu Hanifah and his two students, and we can maybe spend some other time going into the details of who they are, but maybe if we just move straight into the text. Okay, so let's begin to look at the commentary. Ashara biqawli hada, and this is I'm actually going to leave this paragraph out because it's a bit of a linguistic discussion, so I'm just going to leave it out of just to move on. Wal aqidah. So the first word he's going to look at, and what he does is he look at certain words that's in the text of Imam Tahawi. So aqidah, he says here, is it's a verb. It's on a scale of what's called fa'ila. And that means it's a passive participle. Now, if you don't know Arabic or you're not interested in Arabic, this doesn't really matter to you, but it is important, of course, as well, because it signifies to something. When it comes as a passive participle, what's called a maf'ul in Arabic, it's الذي عقد عليه القلب وعزم عزيمة محكمة. This is really important because aqidah basically means to bind, right? And he's basically saying that the heart, because aqidah has to do with the heart here, the heart is bound as in a sense as a firm resolve, right? So when you're dealing with faith, you're dealing with matters to do with the heart, right? As opposed to fiqh, which is more to do, if you like, with the limbs, right? So there is a distinction, if you like, even in terms of the limbs and the heart. So fiqh is to do more to do with the limbs, or more to do with society and your interaction with society, whereas aqidah is to do with your heart, your faith, and it precedes in many ways fiqh, because you need to be a believer first, of course, before you start practicing, if you like, the faith. So الذي عقد عليها القلب وعزم عزيمة محكمة, like a firm resolve. That's what aqidah is, basically. That's the definition that he has provided, the commentator, on what aqidah is. And he says that the reason Imam Tahawi has called وَإِنَّمَا سُمِّيَ عِلْمُ رُسُولُ الدِّينِ عَقِيدَةً, why has he called it aqidah? Because it's to do with binding the heart, بِعَقْدِ الْقَلْبِ, right? It's to do with binding the heart or resolving it's a resolve that resides in the heart. دون العمل بالجوارح. We're not talking about actions here. So in Aqidah, we're not particularly talking about things to do with the limbs. It's to do with belief. It's to do with a state of belief, to do with the heart. Okay? So this is something to bear in mind. This is one distinction that I made between fiqh and Aqidah. So this is important to bear in mind. And so he says, فَكَانَ الْمَقْصُودُ مِنْهُ نَفْسَ الْعِلْمِ. So what's intended by it is knowledge itself, right? بِخِلَافِ عِلْمِ الْفُرُوعِ, as opposed to ilm al-furu' is called legal rulings, if you like, for one of a better word, because legal rulings are to do with jawari, to do with the limbs. For example, the 5-10 daily prayers, etc. Right? So we're not interested in fiqh here. We're talking about things to do with one's heart, or to do with one's faith. Okay? So this is something to bear in mind. And then he's talking about Ahlus Sunnah wal-Jama'ah, because Imam Tahawi is expressing the Sunnah, the Sunnis, if you like, as a Ahlus Sunnah wal-Jama'ah. We talked about this in the previous lesson. But he says, when you say Ahl, the Ahl of something is to do with something that's mulazama. The word he's used, mulazama. Lazim is like one follows the other. So like in logic, you have, for example, when the sun rises, it's lazim, it follows that light comes, right? So the sun and light comes together. So ahl is like something that comes together with it, okay? And then he's talking about was sunnah. Now the sunnah in different contexts has different meanings. So it depends which field you're talking about. In fiqh, it have a very specific meaning. In other genres, in other sciences, they have specific meanings. But it generally talks about, we're talking about the traditions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. We're talking about things like things that are transmitted about him, things that he did, or things that were done in his presence and he didn't in any way object to it. It can also extend to the companions. It can be extended to the companions and to the generation that followed them. So the first 3 generations of Islam, if you like. But here he's going to go into a little more detail for our benefit. وَالسُّنَّةُ فِي اللُّغَةِ الطَّرِيقِ. So the word sunnah, linguistically, basically means tariqa, as we see in Urdu as well. Tariqa means a path. Tariqa means a path. But in the Sharia, it has a specific meaning. Ismun للطريقة المسلوكة في الدين. In the Sharia, so in the legal meaning, it means a well-trodden path. If you look in the books of the Hanafi school, for example, they say الطريقة المسلوكة في الدين. It's a well-trodden path, right? That many people have traversed this path, and that's what we're talking about when it comes to the Sharia. And sometimes it can also refer to the way of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his companions. And as the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "Alaykum bis-sunnati wa sunnat al-khulafa ar-rashidin min ba'di." So stay upon, adhere, follow my sunnah, but he's also extending it to his khulafa, the rightly guided caliphs that came after him. This is part of course, a longer tradition here. And I think in the footnotes, he mentions the source for it. So it's mentioned in Abu Dawud, for example, in Tirmidhi, and it's mentioned Ibn Majah. So he's given references for them, but it's part of a longer tradition. But the point he's making is that the sunnah is not, it has many meanings, but you can get a general idea that it's talking about the Prophet, peace be upon him. It's talking about his way. It's talking about the companions that followed the Prophet, peace be upon him. Okay. Now, what does it also mean? He says, however, here, when we're talking about it in our context, التي كان عليه النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, it was what the Prophet was upon, and وأمر بالدعاء إليه بقوله تعالى. So he's bringing a statement from the Quran that he was ordered to call people towards, right? He was ordered by God, if you like, to call people to, as Allah says, God says in the Quran, قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ. This is my way. I call unto Allah with knowledge, عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ وَأَنَا وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَنِي, and those who follow me. Right? So this is something to bear in mind. So he's talking about Ahlus Sunnah. Al-Jama'ah Jama'ah extends to the Sahaba, the companions, the first generation, والتابعين, and the people that followed them, بإحسان, in excellence. And so this is talking about the tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him, هو الطريق الذي أنا عليه وأصحابي. So he's talking about the tradition that we just mentioned, that the Jama'ah includes the ways of the companions and the generation that followed them. وإنما سميت هذه الطريقة طريقة أهل السنة والجماعة لأنها مخالفة طريقة أهل الأهواء والبدعة. So one of the other reasons, besides the fact that you can find precedence from this in the Quran and Sunnah, is also, if you like to use a sociological term today, it's to otherize, right? To say, look, we are the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and to distinguish ourselves from others, those people who are tariqatu ahawa, people who follow their desires, and bid'ah, people who are the innovators. So something to also bear in mind. And of course, Imam Tahawi also mentions the word madhhab, right? Ala madhhab fuqaha al-millah. Just to give you an interesting sort of insight into madhhab. Madhhab is a place of going because it comes from the verb zahaba. Zahaba means to go. So madhhab is a place that you go to, right? And this is a place that you travel towards. And in urf, it became like an expression for which a scholar arrived at. So a scholar, if you like, travels, he does his research, he does her research, and they reach a conclusion. That's what a madhhab is. Yeah, ala ra'yi kulli mujtahid. And so that's why you say the madhhab of Imam Abu Hanifah, because that's where he arrived at, right? Because that's where he arrived at. Now here we're talking about in a theological sense, not in a legal sense. So this is what he arrived at in terms of his belief, right? In terms of his efforts in understanding theology and coming to certain conclusions, right? And so people follow him. And so this is called taqleed. This is called the way of following. Now, taqleed is often misunderstood, and I don't want to go into it too much because it's a whole conversation of itself. But people often think of taqleed as just like you're just blindly following someone. A more appropriate way of thinking about taqleed is that you accept someone when it comes to legal rulings, a mujtahid, for example, because you recognize that he's an authority in that area because he has or she has the expertise. And so you may not have the evidence, you may not be qualified, just like a doctor, right? You follow a doctor or somebody else because you recognize their authority. You recognize that they have expertise in that field. They've studied for X number of years, and they've studied and they practice that field. And they've been recognized by the medical profession, and they're on some sort of register, so forth, so on. And so you follow them, right? Without actually knowing why, the proofs of why they may be giving a particular prescription and so forth and so on. So in the same way, in a similar way, in the same form of analogy, we follow the mujtahids because we know that through our experience and through our history and through our knowledge of their learning, that these people have done the necessary work for us. And then he says, wal fuqaha. Remember, Imam Tahawi mentioned fuqaha. Now, the word fuqaha is very, very interesting. Basically, what it really means is to have a deep understanding of the faith, right? I'm not going to go into linguistics too much, but it's to have a deep understanding of the faith, like the dua that we make, Allahumma faqihna fi din. Oh God, grant us, not fiqh, but grant us a deep understanding in the deen. And here this is what he says, al-fiqhu fil lughati al-fahmu ad-daqiq, right? That you have a deep understanding and you're able to arrive at conclusions through that deep understanding, right? So it's very, very important, not just basically, narrating rulings, but actually understanding. For example, just to give you a very simple example, when you're talking about wiping the socks, now a lot of people will tell you, when does how long can you wear it for when you're traveling or when you're at home, the leather socks or the special socks, waterproof socks. But having a deep understanding is knowing what is the rationale which underpins all these rulings that stem from from this, right? So, why is it that the timing doesn't begin when you wear the sock, but the moment an impurity, you break your ablution, right? Because logically, you'd think rationally to yourself that the time for beginning when you wear the leather socks or the khuf socks, as they call, which should begin the moment you wear them. But the jurists, at least in Hanafis, will say, no, it begins the moment you break your ablution, right? And then there's a reasoning behind that, and it's consistent, right? And so that's because, for example, just to give you the answer, if you look at the whole discussion then, all the different chapters, it's all based on this understanding that the operation of the socks, the khuf socks that you're wearing, is not to remove impurity, but to prevent impurity, right? And so it becomes operative the moment your ablution breaks, and then all the rulings are like based on this rationale, right? And this is based on Quran and Sunnah as well. So this is just to give an example. So having a deep understanding of God's law is what fiqh is really all about. Okay. And here he's mentioned Fakhrul Islam. Fakhrul Islam Bazdawi is a very famous Hanafi scholar. And his name's Abu Hasan al-Fakhr Bazdawi. And he was an absolute polymath. And he says that fiqh is not just knowledge, so it's not cerebral, it's not just intellectual. وَالْعَمَلُ بِهَا, it's also to act upon it. Right, so this is why you get this distinction that fiqh is not just deep understanding, it's not an intellectual enterprise only, but it's also to act upon the dictates of religion as well, right? So this is something to bear in mind as well. So, for example, he gives the example here. Imam he quotes Imam Abu Hanifah as well, that ma'rifatun nafs ma laha wa ma alayha. Imam Abu Hanifah says fiqh is the self-knowledge of what is beneficial towards it and what is harmful to it as well, right? So it's that knowledge. And he also quotes Imam Abu Hanifah. He also mentions that what is beneficial to you in terms of obeying God and what is harmful to you in terms of disobeying God, in terms of doing things that are forbidden for you. So like it's also it's cerebral, it's intellectual to know, to have a deep understanding, to act upon it, but it's also eschatological. Like, what are the implications of doing X, Y, and Z? What is the implication of violating X, Y, and Z? Right. So it's quite interesting in many ways as well. And then he says that Imam Abu Hanifah and his companions by Imam Tahawi are also referred to as the fuqaha al-millah, the fuqaha of religion, right? i.e. وَهِيَ الدِّينِ الْحَنِيفِي. This is Hanifi is not talking about the Hanafi school, but it's talking about Abraham or Ibrahim alayhi salatu salam, because the Prophet, peace be upon him, was following the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salatu salam. So, of course, if you can consider the play on words as well, because Imam Abu Hanifah is also called, he has the word Hanifa in his name, but it's still referring to the Hanafiyyah, that inclining towards good, inclining towards purity, inclining towards virtue. الذي بعث النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم به لأنهم أرفع العلماء شأنا وأقوام حجة وبرهانا. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this in the last lesson. I looked up this a little bit in terms of why is it that Imam Abu Hanifa and the two companions are mentioned specifically by name and not like other scholars. And one of the reasons I found, interestingly, was at the time of Imam Tahawi, the Maturidi, Imam Maturidi, Imam Ashari weren't well known. But Imam Abu Hanifah, because he preceded all of them and he was in the early generation, his legacy was well known. And especially if you look in books like Fiqh al-Akbar and other books, he spent a lot of time early on in his career, in particular, defending what were deemed to be heretical beliefs. And you'll find this in various books, which I can provide sources for requests, where he spent a lot of time traveling to places to defend dogma, right? So, he became very well known for that particular enterprise as well. Of course, later on, as the schools grew and became well known, the theological schools, Imam Maturidi, Imam Ash'ari, they became well known as theological schools. But Imam Abu Hanifah really preceded them by time, and perhaps preceded them in terms of dealing with many heretical groups that would have been around at the time of Imam Abu Hanifa. Okay, and also like he was unique in many ways, because he was able to combine rational proofs with religious proofs. So he was able to combine what's called naqal, transmission, Quran and Sunnah, if you like, transmitted tradition, with also what's called the aql. Right, and this is what he says, al-Jami'una bayna al-ra'i sahih wal-marwi masmu'. So Rai, as they were called, they were also sometimes derogatorily called the school of Rai, right? The school of opinions, or and so forth. But they were also they were very unique in combining both of them, right? So this is something to bear in mind about the Hanafi school as well. Okay, and then he kind of like praises Imam Abu Hanifa a little bit. He says, look at his knowledge, that he's well known in the East and the West, and it's mentioned by him by Waqi'. That he had knowledge, he had unparalleled success, if you like, in both fiqh and kalam. He was unparalleled in terms of his deep understanding of fiqh. I mean, he basically brought fiqh alive. I mean, it was, people knew it, and the scholars knew it, but he was able to kind of give it some sort of systematic understanding, or systematize it, if you like. I mean, it was always there amongst the companions. When he came afterwards, he was able to systemize all of it as well. So that's something to bear in mind as well. It's also mentioned about him as well. So he says, Qala Hassan, he said, I heard Nadhr bin Shumil say that people who are kind of like really, not really too much into fiqh. Nasun niyam. Niyam comes from the word sleeping. People were sleeping. If you want, in other words, insomnibulant. Right, people were just in a state, they were awake, but they weren't really engaged in fiqh until Imam Abu Hanifa came and he woke them up, literally, right? And he made it clear for them. And he summarized things and he made things clear. Imam Shafi'i also says about him that everyone is dependent on Imam Abu Hanifa in fiqh, right? And it's first mentioned, Ahmad bin Sabah says that I heard Imam Shafi'i saying, and so I said that I asked, so Imam Shafi is saying that I asked Malik bin Anas, right, who's the famous eponym of the Maliki school, have you seen Abu Hanifa? And so he said to him that, he was so skilled that, I saw a man that if he told you that, this column is made of gold, he would be able to substantiate it. Like Imam Abu Hanifa was very skilled in argumentation. This is something that's very special, I guess, about the Hanafi school as well. But of course, one should not restrict his achievements only to his intellectual endeavors. So Imam Ghaznavi also mentioned that he was a very pious person. You'll find these in many books as well about him as well. That Imam Abu Hanifa, for example, used to complete the Quran in the month of Ramadan, according to him, 60 times, right? Once during the day and once during the night. It's also mentioned about him that he would perform the dawn prayer with the same ablution that he had performed the nightfall prayer with, right? So in other words, he was deeply engrossed with his creator at night as well. And so he was well known as well. And this is something to just remind ourselves about Imam Abu Hanifa. Okay. Yeah, so I'll just mention this because we have a few more minutes. So Imam Tahawi, who is Imam Tahawi, he is an Imam in Hadith as well, and he's written many books on this as well. He was known to be this was a famous book that he wrote, but he was known for books that he had written in the school in Hadith as well. So he was a muhaddith as well, and he was known to combine knowledge and practice, right? So that Imam Abu Hanifa was unique in this, or he was special in this, not unique perhaps, but probably well known that he combined knowledge with action, and that his school is like the umda, it's like the mainstay, it's like the foundation of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And that's why he called them the Fuqaha al-Millah. And he chose, and he himself, as you know, Imam Tahawi made a switch. He wasn't a Hanafi. He became a Hanafi. He converted to Hanafiism later on, right? So this is something to bear in mind as well. He kind of came to realization that this is the school that I want to follow. So that there may be personal, God knows best, but there may be personal motives for mentioning that as well. This is probably me reading into it a little bit more. وَذَلِكَ لِأَنَّ أَبَا حَنِيفَةَ, and remember, Imam Abu Hanifah was born in the time of the companions as well. He was born very early on, and he narrates from them as well. And he was well known in the early generation, so the third generation of Tabi'een, right? And remember the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, خَيْرُ الْقُرُونِ الَّذِينَ أَنَا فِيهِ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُم, that the best of generation is the one that I am in, as in the Prophet's generation, and then those that follow them. This is, of course, part of a longer hadith that's actually mentioned in Bukhari. He provides the sources for them. So it's in Bukhari, it's in Muslim. He's saying that Imam Abu Hanifah, he was in that very blessed era of the early generation. Of course, in Islamic history for Muslims, that generation, those early generations of people are really the exemplary people that many of us should aspire to follow and become like. Okay, so this is something to bear in mind as well. I'm actually going to stop here because we're running out of time and I want to stick to my time limit. What I'll do, inshallah, in the next video is actually talk about why we call it Ilmul Kalam. Why do we call it Ilmul Kalam? Why have they designated this word Kalam to what we call now theology? So we'll stop there, inshallah, and we will continue, God wills, next week.